and the message that we just heard. So I'm going to start off by telling you a story. It was 1947, and then the British controlled Palestine. And there was a dinner in Tel Aviv. It was a hot summer night in Tel Aviv. It was about a year before Israel would become independent. And the governor of His Majesty was residing over a black-tie dinner in Tel Aviv. It was before there was air conditioning, so it was a hot night. Everybody's wearing their tuxedos and their gowns, and there's a big banquet. And at the head table is the governor and the leaders of the Zionist movement, including David Ben-Gurion. And Israelis are a little bit informal, and it was hot. So David Ben-Gurion took off his top hat and he put it on the floor, and he took off his bow tie and undid his button and took his jacket and put it on the back of his chair. And at the end of the table, the governor was seething. He became red, he was upset, he was angry, and he scribbled a note to his assistant, and he gave it to the assistant. The assistant brought this note to David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, and he opens the note, and he said that this is a formal diplomatic dinner, and this is a diplomatic insult, and put back your top hat and suit and tie on immediately. So Ben-Gurion wrote back a note saying, "It's okay." Winston Churchill said it's fine. And he gave the note back to the guy. The guy brings it to the governor, and now he's really upset and seething. At the end of the dinner, the governor walks over to Ben-Gurion, and he said, "Look, this is a serious diplomatic issue. I'm sending a text to 10 Downing Street to London, and this will be a serious issue that Prime Minister Churchill will take up with the leaders of the Zionist movement, and this is a tremendous insult." And he said, "What do you mean Churchill said it was okay?" So he said a few months ago, the leaders of the Zionist movement were at 10 Downing Street in London, and they were having a meeting with the cabinet of the British government about the future of Palestine and the future of Israel. And it was a very hot, unseasonably day in London. It was very hot and stuffy in the room. So Ben-Gurion took off his tie, put his jacket on the back of the chair, and rolled up his sleeves. And Churchill looked at him. He said, "I don't give a damn what you do in Palestine, but here, put your suit on." Well, so I guess the Jewish people have to be creative, is a message. So I'm going to speak about globalization and anti-Semitism. And in a sense, anti-Semitism is a complex and perplexing form of hatred. Some observers, like Robert Wistreth, call it the longest hatred. It spans centuries of history, infecting different societies, religions, philosophical and political movements, and even civilizations. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, some have even argued that anti-Semitism illustrates the limitations of enlightenment and of modernity itself. Manifestations of anti-Semitism occur in numerous ideological based narratives and constructed identities of belonging and otherness. In the contemporary globalized world, it appears that anti-Semitism has taken on a new and complex and changing form that needs to be coded, mapped, and exposed. The academic study of anti-Semitism, like prejudice more general, has a long and impressive intellectual and research history. It remains a topic of ongoing political importance and scholarly engagement. However, the study of anti-Semitism largely remains outside of the academy. And this is extraordinary given the legacy of anti-Semitism in the Western world. So, in a sense, there are a small few entities in the universities around the world dealing with anti-Semitism, but it's not a part of the general curriculum. It's not a part of the consciousness and education of the students. And given the importance of anti-Semitism historically, this is, I would argue, a dangerous issue. So Wilhelm Marr, in the 1870s, coined the phrase anti-Semitism. So in a sense, if race is a social construction, what is anti-Semitism? Is it anti-race? Is it anti-ethnicity? What is it? So the term anti-Semitism, in a sense, is also inherently problematic and contains contradictions, though we at ISGAP use it despite these problems. So Wilhelm Marr was one of the four fathers of Nazism and fascism, and he proudly called himself an anti-Semite and coined the phrase. So he was proud of being labeled an anti-Semite and came up with this term. So if you remember, the Germans and the Nazis racialized people. So the Jews were the Semitic race, and he was opposed to this group of people. So I'm going to speak about the history of anti-Semitism in a very broad brush. So forgive me for condensing thousands of years of anti-Semitism in a few moments. But I would argue that there's three phases or three aspects of anti-Semitisms with an S. I think there's three different types of anti-Semitisms. And I'll explain why I think anti-Semitism in some ways is a unique phenomenon of hatred. And I will argue here that in a sense it's inherently genocidal. So unlike other forms of horrific types of hatreds, racism, sexism, xenophobia, other forms of discriminations which are evil, according to Rabbi Akiva last night, and he's unequivocally correct, there's something unique about this form of anti-Semitism, which I would argue Robert Wistrich and other scholars, many other scholars who study anti-Semitism would concur. So when the dominant perspective of perceiving reality, particularly in Europe, but in other places as well, was religion, the dominant religion in Europe was Christianity, and Christianity taught consistently, not all the time and not all the places, but consistently, that the Jewish people cannot have salvation. That if they do not accept the Christian notion of the Messiah, they could not have redemption. They could not receive individual redemption. And this was the teachings of the church, and it's still the teachings of the church in many places, but the Vatican II, there's been significant changes after the Holocaust that are important to note. But that the Jews couldn't receive salvation by not accepting the Christian notion of the Messiah. But what makes anti-Semitism genocidal is that the Jews were blamed for killing the Messiah, for deicide, and moreover, they were blamed for not accepting Christ, not having the ability to have personal redemption, but the inability of the stubborn Jew not to accept the Christian notion of the Messiah inhibited world redemption. So until the Jew would be civilized and changed, the world would not have redemption. So the Jew became the target, obviously, of attempts to forcibly convert, to exile, and to kill. So there's been a long legacy of pogroms in the name of Christianity. And this is a whole history of a form of anti-Semitism. And I would argue when the dominant perspective of perceiving reality shifted from religion, particularly in Europe, to notions of race and ethnicity and biologically determined identities, right? So we have to remember this shift. You think of Herder, Nietzsche, the core element of enlightened Western philosophy, who bought into this notion of race and biology and ethnicity. People like Herder, the founding philosophical intellectual, the founder of multiculturalism, Charles Taylor, Will Kimlicka, the founders of multiculturalism, used the writings of Herder and others as a core element of the policy of multiculturalism, which is sort of this liberal acceptance or tolerance of the other now. is based on this old philosophy which believed that races have innate characteristics. That if you're Jewish or if you're white or African, that you cannot escape the characteristics that you were born with. So there's no conversion. If you're born African and black, if you're European and white, if you're Jewish and Semitic, no matter what, you can go to the finest schools, you can learn classical music, you can dress in top hats and bow ties, but you're still fixed to your identity, no matter what. There's no culture, there's no religion that can change your race. And this idea of racism and biologically determined groups, in a sense, and science and technology, and philosophy and theology, which lay at the core, the foundation of this worldview, perceived the Jew as an impure race and a threat to the purity of the white Aryan nation. And the Jew was contaminating the purity of the race. So unlike the times of Christianity where the Jew had an option, it was exile, murder, or conversion. You can save your life by converting. In this moment of racist anti-Semitism, as opposed to other anti-Semitisms, the racist form of anti-Semitism, there was no alternative. And this led to Jews living in parts of Europe and the Middle East and around the world for centuries, for many, many generations, suddenly were perceived as a different nation, a different race that had to be eliminated. And this type of racist anti-Semitism culminates in the Holocaust. So, in a sense, these are the two anti-Semitisms in a nutshell. I'm just going to take a sip. Now, these type of anti-Semitisms, although we know in Europe and North America, the United States, there's a resurgence of these old forms of hatreds against Jewish people, African Americans, minorities, refugees. There's something is shifting. But I would say that in the university, in the media of record, in liberal institutions, in our Western societies, these type of anti-Semitisms, the Christian form of anti-Semitism and the racist form of anti-Semitism, is largely not tolerated. And I think that if somebody would utter this type of idea in a faculty meeting or in a classroom or do an op-ed in the New York Times or the Guardian or Le Monde using this type of anti-Semitism, I believe that they'd be in serious trouble and they could, it will affect their careers, their social circles. It would cause trouble for them, and rightfully so. But today, the dominant form of anti-Semitism, the accepted form of anti-Semitism, the encouraged form of anti-Semitism, the anti-Semitism that is becoming rapidly acceptable, is an attack on who Jews are as a people. This is the new anti-Semitism, or I would say the dominant form of anti-Semitism. So, the BDS movement, political Islam, the extreme left, the extreme right, demonizes Israel, demonizes the legitimate claims that the Jewish people have to their land, their history, their culture is being erased by various extremist movements, and they are perceived as I've been saying, that the worst epithets you can hurl at a group of people, Israel and the Jewish people, are now on the receiving end. So Israel is illegitimate. Israel was created in Palestine. Israel is a colonial racist entity. Israel is an extension of Europe. Israel is an apartheid state. Israel is a pink-washing state. They use Israel's democracy, so gay people have gay pride and they're citizens. That's not to say there's homophobia in Israel, there is, but they're legitimate citizens and protected under the law. They celebrate their identity. So the BDS movement, the boycott, sanctions, divestment movement, will say that this is just Israeli propaganda using this for gay pride parades and women's rights as just propaganda. They call that they say this is organized pinkwashing. So all these epithets are hurled at Israel in a moment when political Islam cannot accept the other. And I'll get into this in a moment. Political Islam cannot accept the other as equal. So you have political Islam rejecting the fact that the Jewish people have self-determination in that part of the world and insist on being equal, where Muslims, Christians, and Jews, men and women, minorities, are under the law equal. Not to say there's problems, contradictions, or issues. There are, like every other society, but it's set up as a democracy. And for Jews to be equal to a practicing Muslim from the political Islamist perspective is impossible. So this reactionary movement wants to destroy Israel. The Brotherhood, Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, ISIS, Daesh, you can name the movement, and these Islamists, not Muslims or Islam, this political reactionary movement is out to destroy Israel. And then in this sort of postmodern Western moment, where criticizing those who were once colonized is problematic, it's a form of neo-imperialism. So if I stand up and say that Palestinians may have a right to their own self-determination, I believe that, if they're willing to live peacefully in the region as neighbors. But if I say, well, I agree in a two-state solution because there should be peace, but can I live or accept the fact that there is social movements that want to commit genocide against people, that want to do away with democracy, that want to kill gay people, that want to subjugate women? So if I criticize that, then I become the racist, colonial, white supremacist, apartheid supporting Zionist in this Western moment. And it's this red-green alliance that is enabling this sort of new or contemporary anti-Semitism. So on the one hand, you have political Islam. On the other hand, among intellectuals, in the universities, in the media of record, there is this, I'd say, mainstream part of our education system finds Israel problematic at best or worthy of dismantling at best. So if Israel is an apartheid, racist, colonial, fascist, state, as liberal, democratic citizens of the West, of the world, I would say, if this is true, we would be morally and politically obligated to dismantle Israel. Just like when I was in the anti-apartheid movement, apartheid was a crime against humanity, and through our activities in the ANC Solidarity Committee around the world, we were out to end apartheid, because it was a crime against humanity. And as liberals, as social democrats, I would argue we were obligated to do that. So at least politically, apartheid is ended. It's a step. Economically, it's another story. Right? The legacy of apartheid, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, all these things are in our urban spaces, they're in our history, they're in our ideas, they're in our language, they're where we live, where we work, where we go to school. It's still a part of our reality. These things don't go away easily. So if Israel are all these things, we would have to, as human rights activists, dismantle it. But these are the lies of contemporary anti-Semitism. So not only is Israel targeted, but as I was saying earlier, anybody affiliated and associated with Israel also becomes the target. And I want to speak a bit about political Islam. So political Islam is not Islam. David Patterson will be here, and Bassam Tibi will be here. They'll discuss this in more detail. But basically, about 100 years ago, as a reaction to British colonialism, the Muslim Brotherhood was created in Cairo. And it took Islam, a version of Islam, and fused it with European anti-Semitism. Until this time, one could argue that anti-Semitism was a European phenomenon, inherently genocidal, but it was really a European issue. And it was through colonialism, through missionaries, through various political organizations that these ideas began to infiltrate into the Islamic world with Western interaction. And what they did was take European anti-Semitism, Islam, fused it into this reactionary social movement in which European anti-Semitism and even Nazism, and I'm choosing my words deliberately as a scholar here. So European anti-Semitism and Nazism became the core of political Islam. It's the core. It's not the military wing or the extremist wing or some guys get up in a bad mood one day and they say bad things about Jews. No, this is core to their ideology. And they use the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Do people know what the protocols of the Elders of Zion is? Okay. So the protocols of the Elders of Zion came out of Russia or France in the late 1800s, depending on which history you read of the protocols. And it's a forged document that is supposed to be the minutes of a secret meeting in which Jews met to speak about controlling the world, controlling the banks, controlling government, controlling the United States, the Rothschilds, Hollywood, all these things that the Jews, well, it wasn't Hollywood then, I take that back, but that Jews were, were the media, that Jews were, somehow secretly, with a conspiracy, controlling the world. And this document, this lie, sort of spread through this sort of uncertainty after emancipation, where people were enfranchised, where Jews became citizens in European countries for the first time ever in the 1840s and 60s and 80s. And this lie spread throughout society, and also because of the history of anti-Semitism of Christianity, it kind of fit into the, this susceptibility of society. And it's this lie that justified removing Jews from society. It gave rise to pogroms, to regular massacres of Jewish people. And it gave the legitimacy for the anti-Semitism became so far-reaching, it justified removing Jews from society, literally. Putting them into ghettos, taking them out of their homes. The universities voluntarily giving up their Jewish professors and Jewish students. Putting them into ghettos. And from the ghettos into concentration camps, labor camps. And as we know, this lie, these words and ideas played a crucial role in legitimizing the Holocaust. And what we learn as scholars, that words and ideas are very powerful. And the Holocaust did not begin with concentration camps or crematoriums or mass extermination. It began with words and ideas. And this is very crucial. If we can learn anything from history, this is it. Those words and ideas in the protocols of the Elders of Zion legitimize the removal of Jews and the extermination of Jews, of people. It completely dehumanized them, completely made them into enemies of humanity, enemies of Christianity, enemies of civilization, enemies of progress. They were the communists and the capitalists, just carriers of disease. They were the quintessential enemy, the quintessential dehumanized other. And this led to the extermination of the Holocaust, in the Holocaust. Now these words and ideas, and I'm being very rational and calm and scholarly, the dehumanization of Israel, of Zionism, of the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel, you can read any history book. You can read the Quran. You can read the New Testament. You can read the Old Testament. And everybody knows where the Jews come from. It's a core element of Islam. It's a core element of Christianity, and it's certainly a core element of Judaism. It's an integral part of who we are as a people. And the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots So in the Sunni Shiite world, there's a big division between Sunnis and Shiites. The Iranian revolutionary regime, which is essentially at war with the Sunni Muslim world, pays homage and respect to the fact that their ideological foundation comes from the Sunni Muslim Brotherhood. And the Iranian Revolution is as dangerous as its nuclear weapons program is. Its commitment to annihilate Israel and the Jewish people is their spreading of anti-Semitism, which I think could even be more dangerous and damaging. So you have this anti-Semitic movement, which at the core of its belief uses the protocols of the Elders of Zion. You can go on the internet as we speak or when you have time and look at the Hamas Charter. The Hamas Charter is part of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's the Palestinian version of the Brotherhood. And if whoever wrote that covenant or the constitution of Hamas would be one of my students, I would kick them out of my class and kick them out of the university. Why? Because they plagiarize. They literally take the protocols of the Elders of Zion and use it, with no footnotes, no references, as the core of their covenant and their constitution. So their call in their constitution, for the annihilation of the Jewish people. It's not a policy, it's not the radical wing, it's a core element of their constitution. And this is what Western universities, Western governments, Western businesses are in partnership with. And do we wonder why, if political Islam, if the Nazis and fascists use this ideology and use it today in Europe or in Gaza or in Tehran or in Cairo or in Baghdad, in Aleppo, why are we surprised? Why are we surprised when Charlottesville happens? Why are we surprised when some Nazi goes into a synagogue in Pittsburgh or in San Diego? Or some Nazi goes and firebombs African American churches or goes in and shoots people on a Sunday praying in a church? Why are we surprised? Why are we surprised that when we sign an agreement, the United States and Western democratic leaders sign an agreement with the Iranian revolutionary regime and bring them into the family of nations in the international order, a regime that is openly and consistently, and a core element of the ideology is not just to spread anti-Semitism in propaganda, but to carry out a genocide against Jewish people. Why are we surprised that after this agreement is signed and billions of dollars are given in cash, Boeing, Siemens, and multinational corporations line up to do business with this regime who oppress their people in the most horrific ways? Why are we surprised that militias are running around Iraq and Syria with this funding and committing a genocide? And liberal progressive people, when they hear people saying, wait a minute, this deal may not be too good for the region. It's not too good for the Jewish people. It's not too good for the Zionists, for Israel. We are met with silence or even a profound opposition, a dismissal from the conversation. But as Elie Wiesel said, anti-Semitism begins with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. And what is playing out in the Middle East, the dehumanization, the killing, the brutality, is because we've turned a blind eye to anti-Semitism. And this is the world that we've inherited. And this is the challenge of our time. Emmanuel Levinas, who was a great philosopher, do people know Levinas here? A few people know. So Emmanuel Levinas was born in Lithuania. He was a student in France. During the Holocaust, his entire family was murdered. They didn't die, they were murdered. And he survived, and he went on to become one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. Some would say the most important. I won't argue with that. Certainly one of the most important, and I agree. I agree. And I think what he did, and you were saying this on the first night, for the first time, he took Jewish thought and Jewish ethics and brought it to the university. So there's a part of the Talmud called Pirkei Avot. And Pirkei Avot is the ethics of the Torah. So, the Jewish people believe, and Christians believe, and Muslims believe that Moses got the Torah on Mount Sinai. What Jewish people believe is that he got the written word. And like many cultures around the world that many of us here can identify with, there was also an oral tradition. And to understand the written word, you need the oral tradition. And Levinas brought the ethics from the oral tradition and from the written word for the first time into the European university. And one of the most powerful lessons of the ethics, which is tied very much to what Akiva was saying last night, and I think is a cornerstone of the work of Levinas. And this, to me, is powerful, following what Rabbi Zweig was saying. Levinas argues, based on Jewish ethics, that when we see our face in the face of the other, when we see our face in the face of the other, that's the instant we become human. When we see our face in the face of the other, that's when we become human. So, based on that, and based on what Akiva was saying last night, in order to be wise, in order to be human, in order to be ethical, in order to be close to God, to have a relationship with God, you need the other. The other makes you better or makes you worse. You need the other to recognize the other and to see the commonalities that we have, that we're all created in the image of God. And if we're all created in the image of God, that means each of us have godliness or a truth, or what the Rastafarians say, I and I, which is powerful, that the godliness in I. And in other words, I need you to be wise. If I'm a racist, I've eliminated at least 1 billion opportunities for me to be wise. If I'm sexist, I've eliminated, 3.5, 4 billion opportunities for me to become wise. So if I categorize and dehumanize the other, I cheat myself. So I need the other. We need the other. The Muslim Brotherhood sees the Jew as emanating from the urine of donkeys. They see the Jew as coming from apes and pigs, the carriers of disease. So, according to Emmanuel Levinas, when you see a fascist, racist, dehumanizing social movement, there is no negotiation. It's not a cycle of violence between the Israelis and its neighbors. If this is the dominant representative of the neighbors in which the Jews see themselves around in the region, you can't negotiate with this. And this is what Levinas teaches us. If a social movement dehumanizes the other and teaches to obliterate it or to enslave it or to subjugate and segregate it, there's no negotiation. It's not possible. You have to negotiate with your enemy if at the very least you recognize each other as being human. Then you can negotiate. Then you can compromise. Then you can argue and debate. But if you don't see the other person as fully, equally human, there's a profound inability to negotiate. And this is the tragedy. So when we were at BDS rallies at the other department last week, and this shocked my colleagues and I. It really shocked us. We were with an educator, a Holocaust educator, who dedicated her life to teaching about the Holocaust. Her name is Barbara Wind. She's in her late 70s. Worked all over the world with the Polish government, Eastern European governments, the Church, the Vatican. Incredible. She walked out of this 2-day conference. I hope she's okay. She couldn't find her hotel room. She didn't know where she was. The brutality, the dehumanization that we experienced was unbelievable. And you don't experience this, from the waiters and the waitresses and the porters and the decent working people of this country and of the United States. You experience it from the intellectuals. Could you imagine the epithets, the racist epithets that were hurled at us at the University of Oxford? But they feel empowered to do that to this group of people, to Jews, to Israelis, or anybody who has the audacity to recognize that the Jews have a place in this world. And this is the state of our education. So progressive liberals, human rights activists, right? Human rights that came out of the ashes of the Holocaust, human rights law that was written by survivors from the Holocaust, primarily, have now become a tool to smash the Jews. The tool that was supposed to help defend humanity has become the tool to smash the Jews. And this is a tool that is used to smash the Jews by liberals against the Israelis who are in a region where across the line, across the border, what is going on? As an Israeli, as a Jew, I met my Palestinian neighbors and brothers and sisters and tried and worked. We had all kinds of groups, reconciliation groups that I referred to before. If there was something creative on the other side of the border that was diverse and multicultural, and there was art, and there was music, and there was philosophy, and people were being integrated, I would be there. I'd be the first person there. But on the other side of the border, tragically and pathetically, the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots are oppressing and killing and subjugating their own brothers and sisters. And you can I make this argument very seriously. The greatest victims of genocidal anti-Semitism, the dehumanization of the Jew, the dehumanization of the Zionist, the dehumanization of Israel, the greatest victim of this obscenity are Muslims. Their regimes are focusing on the Jew, the Zionist, and the Israeli, and they're massacring their own brothers and sisters. And we liberals in our ivory towers, in our comfortable institutions, remain silent. And we blame the Jews. So the question is, what is happening? And we live in a global age, so the problem is certainly in Europe. France, Belgium, the UK, Jews leaving, Jews moving, political Islamists controlling neighborhoods, controlling mosques, controlling schools in these democratic countries. What do? These are serious problems and issues that a democratic society has to engage in a social, democratic, human rights context. And our silence, the vacuum is being filled rapidly by racists and nationalists. So the stakes are certainly high. So now we have the rise of right-wing anti-Semitism and racism and anti-democratic ideologies. I think so just to put this in quick context, I think all of this is happening, and I think this is what we need: interdisciplinary research, we need interdisciplinary scholarship, we need people from different parts of the world to engage these issues, because these issues are serious. In parts of Asia, Africa, these issues are serious. Through the Maghreb, into West Africa, political Islam. Femi Von, I don't think he'll talk about this year, because he's on a panel on racism and the intersectionality of racism and anti-Semitism. Femi is one of the preeminent scholars of West Africa. And when he taught here in the past, I'm going to speak for him and attribute his wisdom here, but because he won't talk about it this time. But 2 years ago, he spoke about the 3 waves of jihad in West Africa. This is something I knew nothing about, even though I'm a student of jihadists and radical Islam. So many of us look to Africa and assume Africa looks to Europe and the West, but in Africa, people look at the world like we look at the world, or we hopefully look at the world. And Femi has done important research on how the Islamicization of North and West Africa impacted on Africa. And he looks at 3 waves of jihad, and this he considers the 3rd wave of jihad, with Boko Haram and other movements in Al-Shabaab and other movements in West Africa, East Africa, North Africa. They have these issues too, as I would argue globalization is impacting and marginalizing people. And he argues, which is very powerful, how in the 2nd wave of jihadists, the jihadists worked with the British colonialists. They helped to colonize West Africa, they engaged in the slave trade, and they helped the Islamists penetrate into North and West Africa. This is something I never do, and he argues, interestingly enough, that this 3rd wave of jihad, the West's relationship with the jihadists, with the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots, is sort of reigniting or recreating in certain ways these old institutions and processes that existed during colonial times, pushing Africa backwards, economically, socially, politically, divisive, horrible civil wars. And the West perhaps aiding and abetting in various instances. So I think he brings a very important piece to it, and I hope he'll address it. And I think that we have to put into context, why are these reactionary social movements emerging at this time? And I will argue, and I argue in my writings, that this sort of neoliberal globalization, the weakening of the state by neoliberals, structural adjustment, that free markets will fix the economy, bring greater democracy, and the Islamist perspective as the state, the nation state, is a vestige of Western colonialism. So both powerful movements in this globalized economy are pushing to weaken, if not destroy, the state. And we can see states failing. We can see, even in Europe and North America, states unable to cope with basic services, right? So, and our identities are sort of wrapped around the state. So in Quebec, where I grew up, for example, there was French nationalism, there was anti-Semitism, there's racism. It's not, it's a wonderful country, but there's issues there. It's not, like every democratic country, there's serious issues there. But in Quebec, we took, regardless if we were of our cultural backgrounds, we were very proud of our healthcare system and of our education system. I went to McGill University that can compete with any university in the world, the Ivy Leagues or the Oxbridges, and I was paying $200 Canadian a year. For my American friends, that's just astounding. It cost Americans tens of thousands to go to school. When I'm sick today, even though I'm living in the United States, if I can make it to Montreal to see my doctors, I go there. Because in the United States, I feel like I'm giving my credit card to a mechanic and say, fix me. Even for my car, I'll shop around to see where the best deal is and the best mechanic is. Right? It's a business. So I go to Canada if I can. And we had in Quebec and in Canada and Western Europe, these subsidies, these state services, provided a cohesive identity. And even in the third world, places like Egypt and Syria, maybe, top universities weren't subsidized by the state and the healthcare wasn't as widely available as in Canada or France or the UK or other social democracies in Europe. But in Egypt, for example, there were food subsidies. People can get wheat and flour and sugar subsidized by the state. The state provided basic education to a certain age. And this also created a sense of cohesion to some extent, of citizenship, the promise of progress, the promise of development. But as the states wither, our identities become more and more fractured. And these provide this vacuum. In the Middle East, it was perfectly filled by these Islamist movements. And these spaces now, the silence of citizenship, of the migration crisis, of our silence in confronting anti-democratic forces, this vacuum is now being filled, obviously, by very populist and problematic politics. So, globalization. So I think we need an interdisciplinary analysis that looks at issues of power from different perspectives and from different parts of the world. So basically, I'm going to end it here, and we have some time for some questions and comments.
First of all, I didn't get a chance to thank you yesterday, so thank you for having me.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I wanted to ask you about something you were discussing about the Palestinian cause earlier in your presentation. You said something about if the Palestinians were peaceful, if the Palestinians, did certain things to earn kind of a two-state solution, earn a state of their own. And I was wondering if you believe that people have to prove that they're deserving of their indigenous rights. Do you believe we hold ourselves as Jews to that standard? And do you believe that's a standard that should be held for all people seeking their indigenous right?
Good question. Yeah, I agree with it, unequivocally, for sure. No problem. But people have agency. So, do I think that Palestinians have the right to self-determination? 100%. Do I think Jews do in Israel? Certainly. Other peoples? Certainly. But the problem is, as liberals, as students, when that movement is diametrically opposed to recognizing the other, or is controlled, not every Palestinian believes it, but this, for sure, there is opposition. And the opposition in these parts of the world, I would argue, should be, deeply supported and aided and helped and given resources. But to claim to be liberal and to support a social movement that calls for the extermination of anybody, the subjugation of its citizens, the doing away with democracy, the annihilation of Jews, is a serious problem. And I think that we all have to be a part of this globalized world. We have to all be citizens of this world. And that type of fascism, that type of European Nazi-inspired anti-Semitism that it's a core of a movement, no, I don't think there's any place for it. I think it's our obligation to destroy that ideology and to fight it by all of our capacities as intellectuals or security forces, wherever this fascism arises. If it's white supremacy in Charlottesville, or if it's the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, I think that if you care about democracy and you care about human rights and you care about equality under the law, we are morally, ethically obligated to take a very strong stand against it. You can go, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. So why does some guy born in Canada, care about the anti-apartheid movement? It was on the other side of the planet. But that was an ideology that found its roots in Nazism. My family was impacted upon it. I remember flying for the first time to South Africa on behalf of the ANC, and I took a flight through Germany, and it was the first time as a kid I was hearing, German announcements on the flight. And I was looking out the window. I had a stopover on my way to South Africa. And I was thinking, it's amazing. It's a bit of a miracle. I'm going to fight, I'm alive to fight the ideology that exterminated my grandparents' generation. And I felt, this is a miracle. And it's a miracle, and yet I still remember as a student at McGill University, Sam Newmoff, who was a great political science professor, gave it was a course on comparative revolution. So I was a young kind of guy in his class, and he talked about the apartheid system. And I remember vividly, I went up to him after class and I said, Professor Newmoff, when did apartheid end? This was 1984. And he said, Charles, it still exists. So I said, well, when is it going to end? Is it almost finished? And he said, no, not necessarily. They're still entrenched in power. I was shocked. that this Nazi-inspired white supremacy was alive and well. And I would argue, given the history of apartheid, given the history of the Holocaust, given the history of Nazism and white supremacy, in whatever package it's wrapped into, if it's a bunch of skinheads in Lake Idaho, wherever they hang out, the stormtroopers, and practice their garbage, or they're marching in Tehran, or they're marching in Gaza, we, as human rights activists, have to take a very strong stand against it. So I'm against fascism and Nazism and hatred, and I pray to God, and I help, and I work. I work on, I'm very fortunate to work with the Vatican and the Muslim World League and other organizations who are committed, I believe, to some type of basic respect of the other, who are challenging these very dangerous movements. And I think it's incumbent upon us to do so, particularly as students and intellectuals. I argue as a scholar, ethically, I think we really need to be unequivocal. Yes to Palestinian rights. Yes to Palestinian self-determination, but in the family of humanity. And we should support the Democrats in Palestinian societies and in the region, but not the fascists. Thank you.
Dr. Small, I appreciate your lecture, and I appreciate that, as you've mentioned a few times, this is an opportunity for us to educate ourselves around these issues and to engage each other, but also to challenge each other
100%.
civilly on that battlefield of ideas. I'm wondering, though, you mentioned something earlier in your comments. You were talking about earlier in life, I think you were younger, you had a Palestinian friend or peer who you often engaged in these heated debates over. And in order to understand him better, you asked him to give you some books so that you could better understand his ideology, the ideology of the Palestinians and what have you. I wonder if for this 2-week session that we have here, if it would be good for us to hear from some of the intellectuals, some of the others, to better understand what we are trying to understand, obviously, here. And if there was a conscious decision not to have anyone speak from that particular ideology or books to read or what have you. So that's my first question. And then my second is, I would be remiss, we're talking about engagement. You mentioned Envoy Carr last night and his coming to speak, and obviously he's speaking directly to the administration's efforts surrounding anti-Semitism. But from my own perspective and speaking to some of my peers who've been here, it turned into a bit of a political speech. And in terms of challenging, none of us were able to turn into a bit of a political, and we get it. I certainly get it. I've interviewed people like him for a long time. But we weren't able to challenge some of the assertions, which frankly, no ideology, they were things presented as facts that could easily be challenged, and just by the simple fact of saying, well, by what measure are you saying that the Trump administration is the biggest friend of ally of Israel ever? So my first part of my question is about whether we should hear some divergent voices, and the second is just about the lack of being able to challenge.
So thank you for your question. So you'll be hearing from amazing scholars who are experts on the Brotherhood. In your reading list, there are readings from bipolitical Islamists. I would suggest reading Kutub and al-Banai. There'll be scholars here who are really experts on this, and you'll get serious lectures on it. I would read My Struggle Against the Jews, which is a classic outline of what this ideology is about, and you'll hear more from experts on these issues, and you'll get a deeper understanding of the subject matter, for sure. It's an integral part of the program. Number one. Number two, I think Carr's speech became political towards the end. I think that him being here is very important, and I for two reasons. One, the issue of anti-Semitism internationally and international relations has become very important. The United States of America is a very important player on these issues globally and internationally. He I think cares deeply about the issues, and I think he gets the issues. And he's an important voice on the subject matter. Making it a political speech towards the end was his choice. I wish there was more time for discussion. I didn't even really give an introductory lecture yesterday, which I usually do on the first night, but we had 3 important speakers, so I kind of gave way to them, and then there was the film. It was a marathon last night. So I wish there would have been more time. And I think that in terms of, he's an important player. Whether you think some of what he's doing is fantastic or terrible, or it needs to be critiqued or encouraged, and that's what it's all about to me. And I think bringing experts to this forum and being exposed to what's happening in the real political world is very important. And if you like it or you're critical of it, I think the more conversations you guys have in the classroom, over tea and dinner and into the pub late at night, the better. Because this is food for thought. And I think ideas and understanding ideas and debating them and, through debate, it's an integral part of learning. So, if we went for a beer tonight, we may agree on some of the things that Ilan Carr said last night. We may disagree on some, but maybe I'll challenge you and you'll say, oh, I never saw it that way, interesting. Or maybe you'll challenge me and I'll say, wow, I never thought of it, I learned something new. So this is food for thought. He's an important player, and I'm honored that he came, and if you guys agree or disagree with it, beautiful. I hope I answered your question. Thank you. In the back.
I have a question, but first of all, I want to make 2 statements. First, thank you very much for the presentation. Second, I am not opposed to Muslims and Islam, so I want to ask the question on that background. Is there any chance, any possibility that political Islam predates the Protocol of Zion, the Protocol of the Order of Zion, and that the Protocol of Zion provided political Islam with the language and narrative that made its centuries-old hatred tolerable to the modern world? Otherwise, how do you explain the jihad, for example, of Uthman Dan Fodio in West Africa that has subjugated all the tribes there to the point that those tribes have no expression apart from Islam?
So it's an important question. So I would argue, and we have David Patterson is coming, Uzi Rabi, Benny Morris, Haris Rafiq, Bassam Tibi. So these are just off the top of my head. These are some of the experts that will address these issues in a deeper way. They're amazing experts on the subject. I would argue, and I think Bassam Tibi will argue, who's one of my mentors, is that political Islam really begins 100 years ago with the Muslim Brotherhood. But that's not to say that within the Islamic world, the treatment of the other was not problematic. I think something happened 100 years ago with the introduction of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, of European anti-Semitism, and the development of the Muslim Brotherhood, and that constitutes sort of a new phenomenon that's important to understand. And I think what Akiva talked about last night is important. Is it possible? How does Islam and how does Christianity accept the other? And it's a question. It's a serious question. And in parts of Africa, there's been moments in history where Christians and Muslims, for all sorts of reasons, have imposed their will over the indigenous culture and practices. And even in certain parts of Africa, I'm not an expert, so forgive me, but I know that in certain parts of Africa, in addition to the layer of Christianity and Islam, there is kind of a deeper cultural practices and worldview that still exist. Some of which, interestingly enough, is connected to Judaism, historically. So I'm not an expert, but these are all sort of interesting questions and layers that some of the people here, you as well, and others, I think these would be fascinating conversations that I would love to listen to and learn from the people here.
It was very enlightening when you talked about the different anti-Semitisms with an S, and I was wondering if you think that there are Islams and Christianities.
Sure. This is not my area of expertise, but I would say definitely yes. And even in the sort of the most difficult historical periods of anti-Semitism vis-a-vis the relationship with the church and Christianity, there were different interpretations of Christianity and acceptance. And in Islam, the same. There were moments where some of the greatest Jewish philosophers and Muslim philosophers were both revered by both peoples and religions. So there's a lot of overlap. And I hope part of the work that we're doing, it's been fascinating. Meeting with Dr. Muhammad Ali of the Muslim World League and some of his colleagues, we've sat and learned together. I gave them a big book of Pirkei Avot, and we discussed it for several times for many, many hours. So there's a lot of possibilities, and I think as the geopolitical situation in the Middle East is shifting, there is a bit of a rapprochement potentially starting between the Sunni world and the Israelis. I'm of the belief that it's probably short to middle term. It will be around not for a long time, but maybe for short term, medium term possibilities. But in this moment, perhaps it will be possible for the region to see each other as real. For the Muslims, for the neighbors of Israel to see who Israelis and Jews really are, and for Israelis to see who the Saudis and the Gulf state people really are. So if we could begin to see each other, despite maybe the political regimes and actors, maybe this could be a step for something further. But there's something beginning to shift that has, I think, some potential for Muslims and Jews and Israelis to begin to see each other. We have deep common concern right now. So we have to work together to overcome them, and maybe the Iranian revolutionary regime is doing something good by making the Sunni groups and the Israelis work together. So your point is well taken. Thanks.
Thank you, Asha, for this very sometimes painful, but extremely insightful. Thank you so much. Whether this is really a question or whether this is a conversation that perhaps we all can have and reflect on, it's about neurodiversity. Why is it that it's not that about fighting? Why is it that the suffering of the Jew is not grievable? Especially when we think about if Manaladim is the face of the other. Why is the other faces are more recognizable and more grievable? So if you, I don't know if you have time for you to engage this question, because I think also it becomes the root of a lot of the ills that's going on. It seems to me that Jewish suffering and Jewish life is more grievable as opposed to other people's suffering. And this was particularly the case during the so-called BDS interaction, and also when something happens or when an atrocity, a Jewish person suffers an atrocity, it seems that suffering cannot be grieved.
So I think it's a profound question, and we have 3 minutes. I'm not going to be able to answer the profound element of the question, but I'll say this as a start to the response. In liberal education, we are trained to look to the victim, right? So we look at the Jew. Why is it not possible to grieve for the Jew? And our tendency is to look to the Jew. The Chicago School of Social Sociology and Urban Studies, They looked at issues of segregation in the United States, ethnic segregation, and we were trained as scholars, you have to look at the African American community to understand segregation. You have to look at the, why Jews are assimilating, not assimilating, what's successful. We always look to the other. And I would suggest that to answer this vital question, why is it difficult to grieve the suffering and of the Jew? I think we have to look at the perpetrators. What kind of civilization, what kind of society can produce this? How is it possible that Europe did this? Did it start with the Holocaust? What happened in Namibia? What happened in colonialism? So how does this regime and worldview and this civilization come about? So I would suggest we have to look at the perpetrators seriously to understand the worldview for people to engage in this, to look at how these ideologies are sustained and developed, and how, well-meaning people engage in it. One of the things that kind of blew my mind when I was studying the Holocaust and Nazism, there was a realization that, the Nazis, some of them were good sons, some of them were good husbands, some of the wives were supportive, they were good friends. So what drives a society to engage in this? What drives intellectuals to excuse it today? What kind of ideology, what kind of education are we getting when in the name of anything we can legitimize feeding the Jews to genocidal maniacs? So I think the question doesn't lie with the Israelis or the Jews or those who are segregated or enslaved. The focus has to be on what produces this inhumane civilization. And final question in the back, and we're going to be late. Sorry.
Thank you very much, Dr. Small. First of all, I'm thrilled to hear a Western scholar of sound mind talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. Because as a person who grew up in Egypt and very familiar with the Muslim Brotherhood, it's just astounding the amount of ignorance in Western academia and Western almost belief in my culture, really. And I want to just tell one incident that happened to me last night. After an event, I went down to look for some food, and there was a smoked kebab shop around the corner, and I went there, and I started talking to the guy to order food, and then I noticed that he must be Muslim, so I asked him, where are you from? He said, Turkey. I said, oh, that's great, I'm from Egypt. And then he immediately asked me, do you like Sisi or Morsi? And I told myself, oh shit. Then you're only a Muslim Brotherhood supporter if you immediately ask somebody that question. So I was like, both of them are equally bad. Then he told me, no, Morsi was great, and they killed him because he wanted to free Palestine of the Jews. Unsolicited. That was randomly two Muslims, this is how they bought. And this ideology now, unfortunately, came to the West with waves of immigration. And we've noticed a glorious movement in the United States a couple of years ago when it almost hijacked the most progressive women's movement in the history of human civilization, which is just mind-blowing. But when it tried to educate Westerners about this, it's really hard to do it without sounding like a conspiracy theorist. Because, first of all, yes, the Muslim Brotherhood, they do have the Jews at the core of their plan. But it's not the only plan. Like, they have a plan for everybody. They have a plan for you and me, they have a plan for all of us. And yes, it's so aspirational. I get it. Like, it's so aspirational, how then? The question is there a way to talk about it without sounding like a nutcase?
So it's an interesting question. It's difficult, and there's pushback. And the one thing I'll respond is that when I deal with people from the Middle East, intellectuals, people who care about democratic principles, one of the questions that I always receive is, how is it possible that the intellectuals, the Jewish community, other communities in the West are so silent against the Muslim Brotherhood? Don't they understand? Don't they understand the dangers? And as a group, we don't. And I'll just take a survey. How many people have read Kutub and al-Banai, for example? Okay. This is an educated group. I'd say about 10%. If I go to a synagogue, it's about 1 or 2%. If I go to a liberal arts university, it's 1 or 2%. It's nothing. And the audacity is that we're supposed to care about ideas. So people are ignorant. They don't bother to read. This is the cardinal rule of a student. This is a cardinal rule of a scholar. You read. You know, when we were at Oxford, we made arguments in our papers. We would have 10 references, present our paper, and our students and supervisors would rip it apart. And we would go back and rewrite it, and I would come back with 20 references. And I'd give it to them again, and they would rip it apart. By the time I was finished, I had like 60 references. Every hole in my argument was dealt with. Now, there are people here, and there are people in the university that have not read a damn thing, and they pontificate. And if we're serious students, and we're serious scholars, read it, learn it, and then come and debate it. And you may not like my interpretation, and that's great. Maybe you'll teach me something. But if we don't even bother to read the text, if we don't even bother to read the worldview that is a part of this global conversation, if we're so arrogant not even to spend some time learning it, then I don't know what we're doing in the university. So my one powerful message is read the material, learn it, know it, and then argue and debate, but at least debate and argue from a position of knowledge and of scholarship. So on that note, something more important than my words here is lunch is being served.